I'm about to tell you about a stage of my life that still affects my family, which my classmates from elementary school at that time still talk about, although I lost contact with all of them. Even recently at a meeting, someone I didn't know asked me if I was that child to whom everything had happened. My family insists that much of what I'm going to tell you did not happen, that it is my imagination, a resource of my brain to deal with the trauma. Even so, I'm sure that many of those characters who lived around here will know the legend, and even the characters that I'm about to name, I remember everything perfectly, as if it had happened yesterday. Just weeks before the end of my childhood, just weeks before I was born, I'm sure that many of you have lived around here, will know the legends, and even the characters I'm about to name. I remember everything perfectly as if it was yesterday, just weeks before I finished my catechism and made my first communion. Orlando, my brother, just 3 years older than me, had not made his first communion. For some reason, he always refused and never wanted to tell my mother why, therefore making it even become a kind of obsession for her. The first times I went to catechism, she was so excited that she herself took me and was there helping in the church and taking care of my sister Ines, who was 3 years old at the time. Until I finished, however, after a few times, Ines started to cry as soon as we approached the church. She said she was afraid of the ladies in the black, referring to the nuns who lived in the convent next to the church, and so my mother reluctantly let me go alone. Accompanied by a boy, Pedro, who lived a block away from the church. Pedro, who lived a block away from my house and who was always accompanied by his father. However, only one time after that he accompanied us, and then we started the walk to the church in each catechism, only Pedro and me. It was something strange in those days. Maybe there were not so many people in the neighborhood as today, but even so, I remember those walks we did in what seemed to be a deserted neighborhood, when only the strangest inhabitants dared to go out. On one occasion, we left the church late, well, not so late. Instead of going down on the main street, we took one of the alternate streets. It was much lonelier, the way was shorter, and we passed by the elementary school a few blocks from the church, and a sound coming from inside caught our attention. To hear something at that hour in a deserted school, my first reaction was to run. But I turned around a few meters ahead and noticed that Pedro was not running next to me. I slowed down. Pedro was leaning out, climbing on the fence, looking inside the school at the people who were watching us. I slowly returned and asked him what he was looking at between murmurs. He answered me the same way. "Shut up, he'll see us." Then I knew what he meant. Inside the classroom, 3 meters from the school fence and barely illuminated by the light of the street lamps, the figure, the silhouette of a nun looking out, motionless, macabre. I started running again, this time much stronger, as fast as the extra kilos I had and at that time allowed me to run. Now I felt Pedro's footsteps running to my right, when a block later, without slowing down, I asked him what the hell would someone be doing inside the school at that hour. Turning around to my surprise, or rather to my fright, it wasn't Pedro running next to me. Next to me was a little boy, a little girl, a little boy, a little boy, another little boy. I wanted to run faster and turn around to the next street, even though that would take me away from the way home, but the little boy, undeterred, ran at the same speed as me, laughing at me. I got back to the main street and finally lost him then. Totally exhausted, I stopped to rest and then hiding, running from lamp to lamp to take advantage of the darkness of the streets. At that time, I could approach again to my street almost unnoticed. A block from my house, I saw my mother walking in a hurry with Ines. Evidently, she was worried because it was late and I didn't arrive. And when she saw me, I noticed that her eyes lit up with pleasure, but then changed to angry eyes that began to scold me for the concern that I had caused her. "Now go up to the church and look for your brother," she told me. My blood froze. The last thing I wanted to do was go up to the church again, but I tried to explain to him what had happened to me. She scolded me without believing me. Crying, I started my journey again, going back up the hill to look for Orlando, who had gone up to look for me. A few blocks ahead, a scream put me on alert, and suddenly, out of the darkness, 2 figures were running towards me at full speed. I wanted to run towards my house, but out of fear, thinking my legs became absolutely clumsy, and I stumbled, Figures were getting closer. I could even hear their breathing. One ran over me and the other grabbed my arms and lifted me up. It was my brother Orlando, and without saying anything, I knew that something was chasing them. I realized that the figure that ran in front of us was Pedro, and he turned around when he reached the street of my house. He ran into it even without us. He was very scared, I know, and I knew that he was not going to reach my house. When we entered the house, I was horrified. Pedro's face was full of blood, and my mom attended him immediately. She ordered us to call his father. Pedro wouldn't stop crying, and the more they cleaned the blood from his face, the more terrified I became. His father was not there. He didn't answer, but a few minutes later, one of the neighbors arrived and took him to the emergency hospital. My mother kept asking us what had happened, but I had no idea, and Orlando swore he didn't know what had happened to him either. Orlando then approached me to tell me that he was going to tell me what he had seen, but he had to swear not to tell my mother. He told me what had happened. My mother was very worried about me, so she sent him to look for me. He came upstairs and told me what I'd seen. So she sent him to look for me. He ran up the hill, and he was almost to the school when he heard a sound passing over him like flying. He looked up, but there was nothing. So he continued. However, just a few steps ahead, the voice of a child called him from behind his back. "Hey, this way." When he turned around, he saw a child pointing at him. He saw a boy who was pointing at him, and when he saw the child looking at him, he saw the child looking at him, and he saw the boy pointing back towards the street. From the description, it was the same boy that had run beside me. When I was walking away from the school, he was one of the gypsy kids. "Sure, you've seen him," Wright told me. What he saw when he ran towards the street was a lump right in the middle of it. A black lump moving over something or someone. Even though the image was macabre and impressive, he took a stone and threw it, thinking that it was me who was there, being attacked in some way. It was a very strange figure, but human without a doubt, and that didn't make him feel less fear. He hit the thing with the huge stone. It screeched and ran to the other end of the street, jumping up and down. Orlando ran towards the figure of a bloody boy, and when he reached him, he realized that it was Pedro. Orlando ran towards the figure of the bloody boy, and when he reached it, he saw that it was Pedro, and Pedro looked at Orlando's back, being able to barely open his eyes because of the blood on his face. Orlando turned around and saw a group of 4 nuns approaching him in a row in a completely bizarre way, with their hands spliced in front of them as if they were praying, and as if they were taking very short steps under their robes, but they were approaching at an impressive speed as if running towards him. He started to run too, and after a few blocks, he found me walking backwards in fear until I slipped. That's when he picked me up and we managed to get home just behind Pedro. My mom wouldn't believe us, but I had seen them before. She told me they dress like nuns and sometimes they approach the church. They walk around and stare at me. "You know why I didn't make my first communion?" she asked me. "Why don't you believe in God?" I told her more in a questioning tone than answering with certainty. It wasn't because of them. I went to 2 catechism classes too. It was even earlier back then, and we used to play soccer in the space next to the church right in front of the convent. The nuns were very kind. Sometimes we even knocked on their door and they gave us all children glasses of water, but one time we were surprised by a group of nuns dressed completely in black who seemed to curse us in a low voice. While we were playing soccer, they were not on the side of the church, but on the side of the street above the field where we were playing. They were saying really bad things. Very bad things. We were ignoring them, but then one of the younger boys approached them to take a ball. One of them ran towards him as if he was going to take it. He almost started running towards us, crying, while the others laughed loudly, almost screaming. While we were watching them behind our backs, the door of the convent opened, and one of the nuns shouted at us to go into church, but we all ran but managed to turn around. 2 young girls came out of the convent, rushing almost threateningly towards the others who were next to the church grounds. And when they saw them, they started to run, but laughing. I remember that one of the catechists approached us. She was just a teenager too, and she asked us not to play so late, much less when they were there. I asked her if those nuns in black were bad, and she told me that of course they were not nuns, but that they were crazy people who wanted to scare us. At that moment, my brother paused in the story. He took a deep breath as if he had reached a painful moment, then continued. But I'm sure that they were more evil than she believed. That they were not only looking to scare us. Shortly after we saw them for the first time, Raul's happened, Orlando stopped again in his story, but I knew why. I knew what he was referring to. Raul was a classmate of his who had died. They didn't tell me how because I was very small, but I knew that it had been in a very ugly way, and among the boys of the first year of school, they told me completely crazy things about it. For those who don't know, the colony in San Andreas neighborhood